Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste friends, we are in this lecture continuing from our previous lecture, and just to give you a recap, we were talking about nationalist historiography, particularly the broad trends, which broad ideas instead I would say, which shape the contours of historical scholarship in 20th century. And there in the previous lecture we talked about Bankim Chand Chattopadhyay and Rabindranath Tagore. Now we are focusing on another very influential figure, perhaps an ignored figure when we are discussing about disciplinary history, and we are talking about Mahatma Gandhi. You may be surprised that I use this expression that he is an ignored figure in discipline of history. By this I certainly did not mean that historians have not paid attention on Mahatma Gandhi. What I meant instead was we have paid attention to Mahatma Gandhi as a nationalist figure, somebody who guided India's freedom struggle against colonial rule, and we have paid attention to his activities and his thoughts in the field of philosophy, in the field of politics. But we have so far ignored his contribution as far as the field of history as a knowledge concern. In the course of this lecture, it will be clearer what I meant by my remarks. Mahatma Gandhi, and this is also perhaps because among all the figures, intellectuals that we have so far dealt with, whether from 19th century Maharashtra or from Bengal, Mahatma Gandhi has paid least attention to history, and perhaps this is why we have not paid attention to Gandhi's philosophy of history. While Bankim and Rabindranath Tagore, for both of them history was crucial. For Mahatma Gandhi, history was not even marginal. He completely rejected the idea, the field of history. and no matter how provocative it sounds, but his rejection of history actually tells us a lot about the heterogeneous ways of conceptualizing past, which otherwise get hijacked in the disciplinary exercise of history itself. So, he denounced history itself. This was not a question of whether Orientalists paid enough attention, whether they were factually incomplete, imperfect, whether the perceptions differ, whether history was written from rulers' vantage point, as Rabindranath Tagore argued. This was rejection of the discipline itself. And to understand this point, we need to carefully build up the way he has explained and his investment in this argument. It may sound again quite provocative, but the statement, following statement, emanates from his rejection of history, when in Hind Swaraj, which is a seminal text as far as the ideas and experiments of Mahatma Gandhi is concerned, in Hind Swaraj he says in quite unequivocal terms that a nation is happy which has no history. Now, what does it mean? Why is he saying that? If we recall, he wrote Hind Swaraj while on board. This was in 1909. First he wrote in Gujarati, then it got translated in English. He himself translated, and this book, which is a very thin in terms of the count of paper count, which can be and which has been dismissed by many academic scholars as a propaganda text. This, on the other hand, this booklet, this tract has also been widely debated and discussed and appreciated from intellectuals, policymakers, philosophers, historians across the genre. So, when he writes that a nation is happy that has no history, he then goes on to say that history is an account of battles and wars. It is full of violence. And this is why history does not have anything to offer to us. Now, what does it mean to my mind to understand the significance of this provocative statements, this rejection? We have to differentiate between history and past. This distinction often gets lost in disciplinary exercise of history. This disciplinary domain called history monopolizes the domain of the past as its sole spokesperson. Here it is relevant to remind that we just saw Tagore also rejecting or feeling discomfort with textbook accounts of history, and he had argued that that textbook account of history does not capture the experiences of Indian life. In Gandhi's case, when Mahatma Gandhi is rejecting history, this is a discipline which emerged in post-Enlightenment Europe, which claims to be a scientific account of the past. And it is this construct of history which then goes on to build its methodology along positivist framework, where objectivity rules. This particular knowledge construct is what concerns Gandhi when he is rejecting that. So, he is saying that this field of scientific knowledge of past does not have anything to offer to us. In this criticism, he is at the same time bringing moral values, the politics of history itself, and this politics of knowledge, this epistemic frame which comes from Western Europe, from a specific historical juncture, and where in later decades we are told by scholars that how the knowledge and the colonial power, colonialism, both went together hand in gloves. And it was this equation, this root of linkage between knowledge and power that Gandhi is rejecting in totality. Now, when he is rejecting this, he is also providing an opening to think alternatively, a solution. And he says that instead of this particular construct of history, which has replaced all other engagements with the past, he preferred a much more embedded past, and by this he was referring to myths and legends, the way common people perceives and associates with the past. And this is where we find that the past that Gandhi is invoking has therapeutic and healing potentials, unlike the domain of history. Now, if we take the broader perspective or locate Gandhi's rejection of history in his scheme of ideas, then our mind is automatically drawn to the question or the argument that earlier Bankim had offered when he asked this question, that how did we are subjugated to foreign rule for 700 years, and Bankim was inward looking, self reflecting on Indian society, Indian civilization. Similarly, Mahatma Gandhi said, and I quote, that the English have not taken India. English have not taken India. We have given it to them. They are not in India because of their strength, but because we keep them. Quote ends. Again, we have a very deeply inward reflection, a kind of caution which Mahatma Gandhi is offering to his countrymen. However, there is a vast difference between the philosophical structure of Bankim and Mahatma Gandhi, and in the case of Bankim we have tried to gone through the intricacies, and now hopefully will through this discussion on Mahatma Gandhi, the distinctions will get clearer as we proceed. However, this statement that we have not given India, the English have not taken India from us, we have given it to them, in different ways passed on to or percolated to historical scholarships, historical scholarship at different levels in different themes concerning modern India, the time frame that we are discussing in this series of lecture. For example, there is a very vociferous debate on 18th century, its economy, its society, among historians who were practicing almost 60 years after Gandhi wrote this statement. And the major debate among these scholars are whether it was the inherent weaknesses of Indian society that paved the way for British colonialism and eventually to the backwardness of Indian society, or whether it was the exploitative structure of British colonial machinery which then resulted into the further deepening of poverty and backwardness in India. Now, we will have time to go through this when we will discuss the economic history later in one of the lectures. But here, returning back to Mahatma Gandhi, we find the kernel of that debate here. So, Mahatma Gandhi is not complaining to British when he is saying that it is our fault, we have given it to them, we have given our country to them. He is critical, he is addressing his own countrymen. And when he is addressing his own countrymen, unlike Bankim or even unlike Rabindranath Tagore, his language is much more inclusive. And he is addressing to not one or another segment of society. For him, periodization does not matter, because he does not believe in the disciplinary practice of history, which is rooted in periodization. So, once he is out of that vicious circuit of method and discipline and periodization and objectivity and sources, he has all the liberty at hand to offer a very different model, and hence he is not bound by that rule. Hence, he is unequivocal in terms of referring to society. So, he is using the word Indian instead of Hindus or Muslims. The second important point is the structure of Hind Swaraj itself. This is written in the form of a dialogue. Hence, he is explaining his arguments, his concerns as we progress in the text. Due to this dialogic form, which had deep roots in Indian tradition, the arguments acquire a unique texture and appeal. And perhaps this is also one of the reasons why Mahatma Gandhi is one of the most misunderstood when it comes to application of his ideas. Another crucial fact is that, like any other subject, any other aspect of life, in Mahatma's scheme of things, the arenas of life are not clearly demarcated. By this I mean to say that he never believed that economy is separate from politics, politics is separate from dharma, or dharma is separate from moral life. And they, in thinking like this, then his rejection of history is also not separate from his politics or any other, his understanding of knowledge and experience. And in that scheme, faith has a crucial or almost an anchoring role to play. Now, here comes a contradiction, and this is why this is perhaps one of the reasons why Gandhi's idea of history has been misunderstood. History as a modern discipline is rooted in rejection of faith. As a scientific discipline, faith has no place in modern history. It always aspires to speak in the language of science, where facts and categories are or ought to be clearly delineated, defined, and disentangled from their linkages or from their ambiguous moorings. But as I just mentioned, in Gandhi's scheme of things, if you separate one, if you delink one aspect from another aspect, the entire structure crumbles. So, then for the discipline of modern history, how would you reconcile the fact, the scientific fact, the objective quest for the past with myths and legends? Myths and legends can at best be treated as, and that too with great caution, as a resource, a passive resource to glean information, that too with lot of caution. But here he is placing myths and legends, everyday's engagement with the past, in the center. Third, or perhaps one of the most important factors when we talk about why Gandhi has been misunderstood or has been ignored is the gross generalization that Gandhi offers in Hind Swaraj. Gandhiji may be, for the sake of readers, because he is addressing not one particular community or the academicians, he is treating the entire Western civilization as one monolithic block. Similarly, he is looking at entire Indian society as if there are no variations, there are no contesting viewpoints and perspectives. So, two monolithic blocks emerge, one the site to be critiqued, another a site to be defended. Yet I would argue, and scholars have written on this, that when we are judging Mahatma's gross oversimplification, we must not forget that he was writing for ordinary common citizen. Another point we also need to keep in mind, that he was offering another model. So, this is an aspirational model that he was offering, and a model worth pursue. So, we should not accuse Mahatma of not giving us a very layered and textured, nuanced, empirical account of social life in these two civilizations. For Mahatma Gandhi, it was not the backwardness or lack of modernity of India's culture that keeps it in continued subjection. He says that the task will not be accomplished simply by creating a new modern culture for the nation. For him, it is precisely because Indians were seduced by the glitter of modern civilization that they have become a subject people. Now, if we contrast this with what we noticed in the case of Bankim, for Bankim it was the lack of courage, it was a lack on the part of ours to desire for liberty. Here in Mahatma's formulation, which I just read, it is not about lack, it is about a seduction by the glitter of modern civilization. And thus, he is cautioning that we do not have to imitate the West. We have to build upon our strength. We have to rather distance ourselves from the Western world. For him, as long as Indians continue to harbor illusions about the progressive qualities of modern civilization, about this glitter, they will remain a subject nation. Even if they succeed physically driving out the English, they would still have English rule without the Englishman. Again, we are noticing a complete rejection, not just of one or another element of modernity, but the Western modern model itself. Now, again if I go back a little bit and take a recap, we saw that a kind of interplay, intermeshing between civilizational discourse and the political discourse in 19th and 20th century. In Bankim's literature, it is easier to identify the difference. The two are clearly separate, civilizational and political. And he is critiquing the civilizational to match the energy of the political. he wants to respond to the challenges of the political by pointing out the difficulties and how to rectify those aspects in the civilizational domain. In the case of Rabindranath, we saw that he became critical and rejectionist, quite disenchanted by the political, by the idea of nationalism as a political construct. In the case of Mahatma Gandhi, it is extremely problematic to distinguish between civilizational and the political as two separate domains, as if the two are infused into each other, and that creates a kind of ambiguity which history as a modern discipline does not know how to deal with. And this is perhaps also why historians who wrote in later decades gradually kept the praise of the political Mahatma alive, while they often either oversimplify his ideas pertaining to history, or they found lot of incongruency in applying Mahatma's frame while writing history. And this is also a saga which came into play as we advanced in the course of 20th century, particularly from mid 20th century, from 1940s onwards, broadly speaking. This is when institutionalization of modern history began at a much greater pace. When I am referring to institutionalization of history, I am not ignoring what we witnessed earlier in the case of 19th century Maharashtra, where individuals like Rajware paid a lot of effort towards collecting documents, and the efforts of Bhandarkar, Deccan College in enriching the pre-colonial, our knowledge of pre-colonial past. That was also an institutionalization at regional level, but now from mid 1940s this institutionalization was taking place at a much grander level in terms of the scale. Obviously, I am not judging in terms of their merit or qualities. And by mid 1940s, we also come in a scenario when even in nationalist history writings and also in other fields of history writing, there was increasing separation between a populist discourse on history and academic discourse of history. In that sense, academic history began distinguishing itself and started claiming a superior hierarchical position compared to other endeavors in history writing. Not long ago, we know even in 20th century, a great deal of historical energy, intellectual endeavors came from not merely teachers or academicians from university, but those who were social reformers, those who were practicing literature, those who were journalists, and this separation between academic history, academic domain and populist history began to grow in the second half of 20th century. Along with this institutionalization, which we will be paying more attention, the dominant frame guiding nationalist history was rooted in the idea of syncretism, which both Tagore and Mahatma Gandhi had propounded repeatedly. So, now when we look at, for example, the efforts made by Tara Chand, who came up with his book on influence of Islam on Indian culture, this paradigm that Indian history has assimilated all the currents in its fold and has grown richer and richer by centuries. That impetus acquired a front seat. And in that scheme of things, the harmonious relationship between communities was conceptualized as the normal, and only when this normal got disrupted, we came face to face crisis like situation like that of communal violence. So, a great deal of energy was spent not only to demonstrate the ulterior designs of British colonial administrators in fermenting the communal violence, in deepening the communal divides among communities of India, but also an invisible moral model has been presented, an ethical ground has been presented before readers to convince that even though we may differ in terms of our outlook, in terms of our language, in terms of our religion, in terms of our culture, but we essentially carry a strong bonding. This was in many ways quite important both for the freedom struggle as well as for the sake of our nascent nation state. Thus, history came more and more to be recognized as an important stakeholder in the project of nation building. In this institutional endeavor of history writing, particularly from the decade of 1950s, two important projects are noteworthy. In 1957, when the country was completing 10 years of India's independence, we were also celebrating 100 years of 1857 revolt. In the historiography, this revolt has been looked at in various ways. While imperial historians termed it as rebellion, Sepoy rebellion, Savarkar termed it as India's first war of independence. In 1957, Government of India commissioned large projects to look at different dimensions of 1857. Another massive project was for the compilation of a history of the freedom movement in India, and here the attempts were made in each state to have accounts of their share in this history. Committees were formed under the guidance of the most renowned names in their respective fields of history, and this was also the time when a need was felt to revisit and rewrite old imperial gazetteers under the new title of Indian Gazetteers on all India basis. So, we are gradually seeing increasing investment of state in the project of history writing. For historians, writing history acquired an element of service to nation. For example, in 1961, when NCERT came up with its textbook committee, for history Professor Neelkant Sastry, Muhammad Habib and P.C. Gupta were made in charge. The underlying current, the statement was that history should not recite myths, but provide secular and rational explanation of the past. This became increasingly important, and it would be interesting to mention one anecdote with which we end this discussion. And one of the most prominent historians of India, Professor Romila Thapar, recalls that when she was approached to write the textbook of for class 6th, which was on ancient India, she was little hesitant initially, but then people argued that her colleagues and well-wishers argued that you should take this responsibility, because history writing is a national cause. She writes that she also got convinced that history writing was a national cause, and as such I should agree, and she agreed to write this textbook. So, this equation between a discipline and the nation further got stamped, and in the coming decades of 60s and 70s, we have a robust scholarship following the overarching frames of nationalist history. We will have occasions to look at one or another aspects of it in our coming lectures, and where we will also have occasions to judge and to observe how within nationalist frames a very richer and nuanced and critical engagement emerged in coming decades. Thank you.